My name is Rachel. I'm 43 years old, a high school biology teacher in Denver, and on a Tuesday evening in October, my husband of 19 years sat our 16-year-old son down at the kitchen table and told him in front of me that they were going to take a DNA test together that weekend. He did not ask me first. He did not ask Ethan if he wanted to know. He had already ordered the kit. It was sitting, already opened, on the counter behind him, like he had been waiting for the right moment to make it impossible for either of us to say no. What my husband did not know, what he had no framework to even imagine, was that the test he was so confident would finally give him an answer would instead hand him a different one entirely, one that would take apart 19 years of his own carefully maintained story in front of our son before that month was over. Welcome back to the long game. Some betrayals are loud and immediate. The ones that take the longest to surface are the ones that get to sit quietly for 2 decades before the truth finally has somewhere to land. Subscribe before we go any further and tell me your first name and your city as the comments. Now let me take you back to before that Tuesday, because you need to understand the 19 years that made this moment possible before I tell you what the test actually revealed. I met David when I was 23. I was finishing my teaching certification. He was 26, already 3 years into a sales career at a regional medical equipment company, charming in the specific way that men who are used to being believed are charming. We married 2 years later. Ethan was born the following spring, 11 months into our marriage, 2 weeks early, 6 pounds 2 ounces, with a head of dark hair that David's mother commented on at the hospital, lightly, the way people comment on things they will bring up again later without quite admitting that's what they're doing. David's family is fair-haired, has been for 3 generations, going back to photographs I've seen of his grandparents. Ethan's hair was dark from birth and stayed dark. I did not think about this at the time. New mothers do not generally catalog their infant's hair color as evidence of anything. I certainly didn't. I need to tell you something about my own family history here, because it matters later, and because I did not fully understand its relevance myself until I was sitting at that kitchen table, 19 years later, watching my husband open a DNA kit. My grandmother on my mother's side, a woman named Vera, was half Sicilian, with the kind of coloring that occasionally produces a dark-haired, dark-eyed child 2 generations down even when both parents are fair. My mother used to mention this when people commented on my own unusually dark eyes as a child, given that both her parents and my father were light-eyed. It was a known thing in my family, a recessive trait that surfaced periodically, the kind of genetic footnote families pass down as a piece of trivia rather than information anyone thinks they'll need someday as evidence. David's mother, Linda, never asked me directly about Ethan's coloring. She did something quieter and, I would learn much later, considerably more damaging. She mentioned it to David, repeatedly, over years, always lightly, always as an observation rather than an accusation, the kind of comment designed to plant something rather than confront it directly. He doesn't look much like your side, does he? Strange how dark his hair stayed. You'd think with your coloring and Rachel's, he'd have come out lighter. I did not hear most of these comments directly. I heard about some of them years later from David himself in pieces during the period when everything finally came apart. But I want you to understand that this seed had been planted in my husband's mind by his own mother before Ethan was even out of diapers, and it had been watered carefully and consistently for 16 years. I want to be precise about something, because precision matters in a story like this one. David never once, in 19 years of marriage, directly accused me of infidelity. He never confronted me. He never asked a direct question I could have answered directly. What he did instead was something more corrosive and considerably harder to address, because you cannot defend yourself against an accusation that is never actually made. He would go quiet sometimes after a comment from Linda. He would look at Ethan a beat too long at certain moments, school photo day, a sports banquet, any occasion where Ethan's appearance was suddenly the visible center of a room. He never said why. I noticed the pattern without having language for it for years. The way you notice a draft in a house before you ever find the source. Ethan is and has always been, by every measure that matters to me, entirely his father's son in temperament. He has David's exact laugh, a specific two-note thing that comes out before he can stop it. He has David's stubbornness, his way of going quiet when he's working through a problem rather than talking it out loud the way I do. He has my husband's hands almost exactly, long-fingered, restless. I used to point these things out gently in the early years when I still half understood what was happening beneath the surface of certain silences. David would agree pleasantly and the conversation would move on, and I told myself the strange weight in those moments was something I was imagining. I was not imagining it. I learned this with absolute certainty on a Tuesday in October, 16 years after Ethan was born, when my husband opened a kitchen drawer, took out a DNA testing kit he had purchased without telling me, and told our son they were doing this together that weekend. I need to walk you through that evening in detail, because every detail in it matters to what happened over the following 6 weeks. David waited until dinner was finished. Ethan was clearing his plate when David said, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound casual and was not succeeding, that he had gotten one of those ancestry kits, the kind that tells you about your heritage, and thought it would be fun for him and Ethan to do it together. Father and son, see what they found out. Ethan, 16, mildly interested in the way teenagers are mildly interested in things adults present as fun, said sure, sounded cool. I sat at the table and watched my husband perform casualness with the specific tension of a man who has rehearsed a sentence many times and is relieved to finally have said it out loud. I knew immediately this was not an ancestry kit in the way David was describing it. I am a biology teacher. I know what an ancestry test looks like, and I know what a paternity grade DNA comparison kit looks like. And the box on our counter, which I examined after Ethan went up to his room that night, was the second kind. David had purchased a direct paternity test, framed it to our son as a fun heritage project, and was planning to administer it without ever using the actual word that would have required him to be honest about what he was doing or why. I confronted him that night after Ethan was asleep. I want to tell you exactly what he said, because I have turned this conversation over in my mind more times than any other in our marriage. I asked him directly what the test actually was. He did not deny it. He said quietly, sitting on the edge of our bed, not looking at me, that he needed to know. I asked him to clarify what he meant by needed. He said, I need to know if Ethan is mine. 19 years of marriage, 16 years of raising a son together, and that was the first time my husband had ever said that sentence out loud in our house. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it surprised even me. I did not feel panic because I knew with absolute certainty what the test would show. I felt something closer to a strange, cold clarity. I asked him how long he had been wondering. He said quietly, years. I asked him why now. He said Linda had brought it up again at her birthday dinner the month before, in front of his sister, a comment about Ethan's coloring dressed up as a joke, and something in David had finally cracked under the accumulated weight of comments he had been absorbing silently for 16 years, without ever once bringing them to me directly. I told him to do the test. I told him I welcomed it. I told him I wanted him to understand exactly what 19 years of silent suspicion had cost our marriage, regardless of what the results said, because the damage of the question itself did not depend on the answer. I need to tell you about the 6 weeks between that conversation and the day the results arrived, because this is where the story changes from something about doubt to something about an entirely different kind of secret, one David did not see coming at all. I am a methodical person by training and by temperament. I teach biology for a living. I understand chain of custody. I understand how lab results work. And somewhere in the first week after that conversation, a different thought began forming in my mind, one that had nothing to do with Ethan's paternity, which I was not worried about, and everything to do with a different question I had never had reason to ask before. If David was finally taking a DNA test seriously enough to administer one to our son under false pretenses, I wanted to understand exactly what kind of test it was, exactly what lab was processing it, and exactly what David's own DNA would reveal alongside it, because a paternity test does not exist in isolation. It produces information about both parties being compared. This is the part of the story I did not expect to be telling you when I started recording, because I did not expect to find what I found. But 16 years earlier, before Ethan was born, David had donated blood at a company health screening that included, as many corporate wellness programs do now, a genetic health marker panel, an early version of what's now standard. I knew this because I had been the one to drive him to the screening, sit in the waiting room, and later help him understand the results, which had flagged a marker associated with a specific hereditary kidney condition that ran, according to the report, on his paternal line. David had never had a reason to think carefully about that report again. I had, because I am a biology teacher, and because 11 years ago, when David's father, Frank, was hospitalized for kidney failure at 61, I had quietly pulled that old screening report from our files and confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that the genetic marker in question was specifically and reliably associated with the maternal line of inheritance for that particular condition, not the paternal line the original report had vaguely suggested. A detail I had researched thoroughly at the time out of simple intellectual curiosity, the kind of thing that becomes relevant to a biology teacher's mind and then sits quietly for over a decade waiting for a reason to matter. Frank is not biologically David's father's father. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because it took me a long time during those 6 weeks to fully accept what the genetics were telling me. Cross-referenced against family medical history, David himself had told me casually, over 19 years of marriage, about an uncle on Frank's side who had the same kidney condition that should not biologically be appearing on that side of the family tree at all if Frank were genuinely the common ancestor. I am not a person who goes looking for secrets that are not mine to find. I want to be honest that I sat with this realization for several days before deciding what, if anything, to do with it. But David had opened a door in our house that had been closed for 16 years, a door about whose blood belonged to whom, and once that door was open, I found I could not simply close it again and pretend I had not seen what was visible from where I now stood. The lab results for Ethan's paternity test arrived on a Thursday 6 weeks after that dinner table conversation. David opened the email at the kitchen table, the same table where he had first announced the test to our unsuspecting 16-year-old son. I watched his face while he read it. The result was unambiguous, the way these results always are when the answer is yes. Probability of paternity, 99%. Ethan was, as I had known with total certainty the entire time, completely and entirely his biological son. I watched something complicated move across my husband's face in that moment, something that was not quite relief, because relief implies you expected a different outcome and are grateful to be wrong. David's expression was closer to the specific exhaustion of a man finally setting down a weight he has been carrying so long he had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it, mixed with something else underneath it, something that looked almost like shame, though he would not have used that word himself. I let him sit with that for a moment before I spoke. Then I told him I needed to show him something too. I had, over the previous 2 weeks, quietly gathered the documentation, the original corporate health screening report from 16 years earlier, the research I had compiled on the actual inheritance pattern of the kidney marker in question, printed from peer-reviewed sources, the kind of citations I require from my own students. A timeline I had constructed of the family medical history David had told me over the years, the uncle on Frank's side, the specific condition, cross-referenced against what the genetics actually indicated about which branch of the family it could plausibly have come from. I told David, as gently and as factually as I knew how, that the question he had spent 16 years quietly asking about our son was, biologically speaking, a question that pointed in an entirely different direction in his own family, one his mother and his father had apparently never told him about, and possibly never told each other about either, given how naturally Frank had always spoken about David as unambiguously his own. David did not respond well initially. I want to be honest about that rather than smoothing it over. He told me I had no right to have pursued that information, that it was not mine to investigate. I told him, calmly, that he had spent 16 years silently investigating mine. Every time he looked at our son a beat too long, every time he absorbed one of his mother's comments without ever bringing it to me directly, and that I had simply finished the conversation he had been quietly having without me for over a decade and a half. What followed over the next several months was not the explosive confrontation you might expect. It was something slower and, in its way, more difficult for David to sit with. He requested his own follow-up genetic testing, more comprehensive this time, working with an actual genetic counselor rather than a corporate wellness screening, to understand definitively what I had found. The results confirmed what the original markers and the family medical history had already strongly suggested. Frank was not David's biological father. David's mother, Linda, when finally confronted, gently but directly, by David himself, did not deny it once the genetic evidence was placed in front of her. She told him, after a long silence at her own kitchen table, that she had been involved with someone briefly during a difficult period early in her marriage to Frank, a period David had never known existed, and that she had made the decision 58 years ago never to tell anyone, including Frank, who had raised David entirely believing he was his own son and had, by every account, been exactly that kind of father to him in every way that actually matters. I want to be careful here, because I do not believe this story is mine to use as an opportunity to villainize Linda the way I could villainize David for what he put our family through over 16 years of silent suspicion. What Linda did was a different kind of secret, kept for entirely different reasons, in an entirely different era, and the consequences of her silence and the consequences of David's silence are not equivalent, even though both grew in their own way from the same human instinct to avoid a conversation that felt too dangerous to have. What I will tell you plainly is what David's silence cost specifically. It cost our son 16 years of being looked at, periodically and almost imperceptibly, as a question rather than simply as a child. It cost our marriage a foundation of trust that I am still, honestly, in the process of rebuilding, because the damage was never really about the DNA test itself. It was about the 16 years of silent suspicion that preceded it, the comments David absorbed and never once brought to me directly, the choice to finally act, not through an honest conversation, but through a manufactured pretext, a fake ancestry project sprung on our unsuspecting son at a dinner table without either of us having any say in it. Ethan knows now, in an age-appropriate version of all of this, because I made the decision, the same decision I have made before in difficult situations, that he deserved an honest accounting rather than a fragmented one assembled later from things he overheard. He took it, in the way 16-year-olds often surprise you, with more equanimity than either David or I expected. He told me, a few weeks after everything had settled, that the part that actually bothered him was not the test itself. It was realizing that his father had been looking at him differently for years without ever telling him why, without ever giving him the chance to understand or to ask his own questions about it. David and I are still married. I want to be honest that this is not a story that ends with me walking away with everything and David with nothing, the way some of these stories do. This is a quieter resolution, and in some ways a harder one, because it required David to actually sit with what 16 years of silence had cost the people he loved most, rather than simply being confronted and removed from the picture. We are in counseling, individually and together. It is slow, it is not finished, but it is, for the first time in 19 years, honest in a way our marriage had never quite managed to be before that Tuesday in October. I think about that DNA kit sitting on our kitchen counter often, the one David purchased without telling me, intending to use on our son to finally quiet a doubt his own mother had planted in him before Ethan could even walk. I think about how certain he was that the test would finally give him the answer he had spent 16 years afraid to ask for directly. I think about how the actual answer, when it finally arrived, was never the one he was looking for at all. If you are carrying a question in your own life that you have never asked directly, because some part of you is afraid of what asking will cost you, I want to leave you with this. The cost of the silence is very often higher than the cost of the question itself. David's silence did not protect him from 16 years of doubt. It only delayed the conversation, and in delaying it, it cost our son 16 years of being seen clearly by his own father. Ask the question. The truth, whatever it turns out to be, is almost always more bearable than the years spent quietly wondering. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever asked a question you had been afraid to ask for years, and what you found on the other side of it. For more stories like this one, come find us on the channel. Every story here is about a truth that took longer to surface than it should have, and what happened when it finally did. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.